everyone seems to have a bit of a grasp and an understanding of that idea of the third place. So it's this place between home and work that we come to for some social interaction. It's the safe, accessible place that we feel that we can come, we can better ourselves, and we can learn from each other. The idea today is that we have a look and really have a look and see how it can transform just an everyday public space. So the concept really is just about people and place. You know, for those of you who were here earlier, managed to look outside and just survey the land that we have there. It's about place and people, and everyone's really excited about what's going to potentially happen through here, particularly Simon, it seems, who's got a balcony on the second floor. So the proposition that I've been working on over the last probably 7 or 8 years is this idea of third place, and being able to connect the sports and the architecture into how there's an opportunity here for how can our sports facilities be that new third place. So there's a couple of things in that. One is around our sports and community facilities, but it's also about that idea of what is the new third place, or what can that be. So I just want to take you on a journey a little bit about my thoughts around this idea of evolution and transformation in terms of what that might be. And a lot of it is based around our own our perspective that we have on ourselves, where we've come from, what makes us tick, both socially and the way that we grew up. So for me, I was brought up in South Auckland in New Zealand, and then had a lot of my youth around this idea of freedom to explore, this freedom to express ourselves, but also a freedom to be able to play. So I went from South Auckland then to North Auckland. And like any city, there's this dynamic between South Auckland and North Auckland, or the North and South tension that goes on. So I was able to learn a lot in terms of a social connection and a place, going from a traditional to a new age or a new way of thinking. And taking that through into an international career of hockey, which was over about 12 years. I never had a lot of talent, but I worked hard and was able to just understand a little bit around my environment, but also our role that we have within those teams and within that environment. So that was then. Now, what I like to try and do through that sports and architecture is to try and spend some time thinking about how we might look to connect between people and organisations. That's what really interests me and has drawn me to this idea of where can third place and where can our sports facilities or our recreation, leisure, community facilities, where can they sit? So in thinking about the idea of third place, it's an archaic term. It was developed in mid-century US largely, but was driven around the pub or the cafe, largely male-orientated spaces. You know, in today's world, this has changed, and I think that there's an opportunity for us to be able to enrich it through our people and place, but also through design, through the architecture. But architecture or design can mean a lot of various things: landscape, planning. So when I come from an architectural point of view, I know there are some planners sitting in here as well. We all have a slightly different view on it. But the idea is that we are designing these places for people to occupy. And with that comes an emotional connection. So harking back to where we've come from and what our viewpoint is, what is your viewpoint? What are the pieces that you're bringing into the thinking and on this concept of third place, and what does that mean to you going forward? I guess we can always come up and say, well, so what? Do we really need this third place? Well, just hearing through here that ability or that drive for organisations to connect, whether it be through a generational connection or Simon saying through a range of literally the fans and the community and the places that we have. If we want to try and engage people, what do we need to be able to change? So moving that on is the slogan that we've started to develop some thinking on, is the third place thinking. So we've taken an old concept and how can we all transform it through an emotive connection, but also through design, and look to overlay it in the decisions that we're all making, either through council, through some strategic or policy directions, but also on the ground in terms of buildings, field of play. How might we look to design and contribute to that? So the third place thinking, what is that? So one of the themes that we've been thinking about is this idea of what role does our community infrastructure have? And it's crucial, I believe, in being able to create resilient communities. Community infrastructure, that thing which sits between home and work, how can we connect with that, and how does that end up happening with us? So we were involved in some of the work with the rebuild of the Christchurch earthquakes, where there was a devastation of some sporting facilities right across the town. They had undergone quite a bit of work and some strategic understanding of where their facilities might be, and all of a sudden this event gave rise to them to be able to just pause and rethink and just reflect on where they had come from and what were the needs that had been developed in the strategic planning and rollout of their recreation facilities, and how might they look to end up progressing through with that. So there were a couple of different sports or community facilities that were developing at that time. There was a high performance venue, the Metro Sports, and we were involved in more the community side of it. But there was also an aspect to that which overlaid and allowed us to transfer across this idea of multi-sport and sharing and collaboration, and see where that might work across the different codes, but also some really, really interesting dynamics between community-based play, so the day-to-day use of the individual sports and the codes, and what that looks like transferring through some regional, the regional sports bodies, and then up to a national and international event. So we had this really, really detailed overlay of community and high performance, which I'm really, really interested on given the background, but also how you oscillate between this day-to-day operation and need based on the grassroots level community, and how that flips into event mode to be able to cater for some international hockey match, for example. So there were some really, really interesting conversations, and ultimately to try and pull that together. Now, the other part to that is around that social aspect. So Simon talked about the Marvel Stadium and the outward looking and what they can do with the plaza. You know, in this example here, in the master plan that we developed, that was then developed, we worked hard to shift the car away. You know, to get away as sports active people, that need to be able to drive the car up to the pavilion or drive the car up to the sports fields. The collective group decided, no, we're okay to park the car 100 meters, 50 meters away. We can walk. And what that left us to be able to do is establish this idea of a pedestrian boulevard or a plaza or a spine that could also have a multiple range of functions. So it could set up as a day-to-day mustering area so Saturday morning it just goes bananas with the kids out there and the parents. But also in event mode, it allowed us to set up we could section off areas of that to allow for hospitality or event mechanism or concessionary trucks, food trucks, that type of thing, to try and create that experience and that connection. It wasn't just about a functional requirement to drive a car up to the front gate. So in terms of that social piece, it's been a really super successful piece around how we can look to activate. Now, of course, we've had the Australian bushfires that have occurred over from late 18, 19 through 20, and massive devastation on such a wide range of area. But also part of that is the phenomenal donations and contributions by private and public celebrity people coming through. So there's a real challenge there, I see, for the councils about all that money coming in. You know, strategically, how do we look to roll out, and what do we roll out to meet the needs of those people? So if we think that once we get like the earthquakes, once we get the roof and the shelter and the water running for people, what is the next thing for us to be able to engage and try and create that glue that'll bring the community together? And so I think this is where the role of our community facilities, sports facilities, can come into play. And so one of the projects that we had to look at was, how do we connect the community groups and the sports groups together? Because often there's tension there, isn't there, where you get community groups who are not actually sports people. In fact, a lot of them hate sport. But the ability to be able to try and get a community centre in this particular project placed right in between two fields of play, and still allow the community to come in and engage with the sporting club in another building, allowed us to just be careful about not duplicating space. It also gave us the opportunity to try and draw the community group, the non-sporting community group, bring them in and have them mix and mingle. And actually a lot of the tensions were broken down, because a lot of them were grandparents of the kids anyway who were playing sport. But it took a lot of courage from the council and also in the project group to go, well, you know, here's the chance with the devastation of the old community hall, where can we put it? How do we roll that out? And where can we create the best value? for our community. Of course, COVID came along and has presented us with a whole other, this idea of third place. Now, I don't know, our kids spend a lot of time in their third place, which is the virtual third place. You know, what does this start to think about us in terms of esports and the development of physical hard buildings or facilities? Now, this is going to open up something really, really interesting for us to be able to look at. So out of that is what is the future? So it's around that built environment and the community infrastructure, and what sort of role can that have, and how do we look to transform that? What does that look like, and what are the pieces of our community infrastructure? It's certainly this guerrilla building within our parks. Now, certainly through COVID, I know Moonee Valley had some challenges here. The kids want to get out and they want to get a spade and they want to be able to dig their tracks and occupy and create a place for them that they feel safe and that they can occupy. What do we do with that? How do we take part of that? This idea of organized chaos, where we design and can develop some play spaces that looks like chaos, but actually if you put kids in there and mixed use in there, it can create a real dynamic environment which people can occupy. The stadia thing, Simon's talked a little bit about that. You know, typically inward-looking facilities, how can we change that, and what is the role for that within our third place? Certainly commercial development offers up a really, really interesting opportunity for us to be able to really explore just a traditional office space or traditional commercial development and what the role is there. Integrated housing within sporting environments, and the Moonee Valley project here is a really good case in point. We've got some work on the periphery and we've got some work on the infield, but there's also some existing uses and some existing groups there. What are the challenges, but where are the opportunities with the mix and the sharing that can go on to try and get the utilization out of the land space that we've got? Certainly office space, the third place is where we can occupy a little bit of the field of play. Is it an education space? What is the role of our education space within our community facilities? Retail's got a bit. We've got programs which we're rolling out as well with the kids, and community centres we've touched on a little bit. There are a couple of little ingredients that have tipped our way just in terms of understanding the impacts of it and what makes up that third place. So the piece that we're really, really interested at the moment, what happens at that intersection of sport and the community, and how can that enrich those places that from a design perspective that we're looking to input on. Certainly history, tradition, and culture are three really, really big factors in terms of what that is. And often when you talk with these groups in a multi-code discussion or stakeholder discussion, there's often probably only 2, 3, maybe 4 key areas that a lot of them are really, really protective about or uncertain about. And it's around history. How is that represented, the culture and the tradition? How do you take an identity that's been there for 100 or so years and bring that through into a new development? How does Moonee Valley look to bring the flavour in on a new project? And so from a design perspective, there's some real challenges there, but there are also some opportunities for us as well. So we see the challenge at the moment is around that scalability and intimacy. At least this is what I think. If we can take a look at a range of facilities that we have, so everyone understands their domestic house. Everyone understands the scale of that, the texture of it, the intimacy of it, the smell of it. You feel comfortable and you feel safe. What would happen if we took some of those pieces of that and then look to scale that up? So we scale it up into a community facility, a regional facility, and then into a stadium. Would that not help us all with that ability to be able to want to hang out there more, to connect, to have that as our new third place? I think it can. And so from a designer's point of view, if we can capture some of that residential domestic scale and we can scale that up successfully, then I think we're going to be in a really, really good position to be able to do it. So a couple of slides, how do we scale for it? How do we design for it? These are some really pressing questions. How do we localize it? Because we can easily develop a third place, let's say in Sydney, and try and replicate there, but it's not going to work. So how do we localize it? How do we overlay the culture and environment that goes on it? What's the impact of it in terms of the surroundings, but also the people? If we're looking to establish built forms that have a 50, 100-year life, what is the impact of that? It's very, very hard to try and project that forward. What is the best value for it? How do we deliver it? how do we apply it, but ultimately, how do we better connect the community? I think it's a question that we always have when we design. How can we better connect the community with what we're doing? It's not necessarily about the object, but we're designing experiences and we're designing stories, I think is the basis. So that idea of crafting scale and intimacy, we talked earlier about the residential and how we scale that up, and we've talked about the value of the sustainability piece. How can we create that network which can ultimately service the local people? The way that I think there's a way forward in terms of some process. So the way that you traditionally look, and if we look at something like an Olympic Games, which one day I'd like to be able to be involved in a bit on that. Actually, Brisbane's just reasonably successful quite soon. Is we start off with this master plan, this broad idea of what that could be. And then we overlay what that event is. So what is something like the Olympics? What is that going to overlay, and what does that look like over the top of our master plan? And then we fashion out our legacy plan. So what happens after that? So the London Olympics, we saw the idea of temporary and permanent structures being broken down or built up depending on capacity day to day, but what is that legacy that goes back? And I'd like to add the idea of the social plan. We need to overlay the social plan over the top of all of that other process to figure out how it will be in terms of a third place and somewhere that we can all occupy. So the question that we've been asked as part of this NGV event has been designing the world that we want, and how can we transform and shape life? You know, I think it's through that idea of subtle evolution and intimacy, and with the ability for us to be able to make a transformation that is really, really, really positive. So the concept is around that idea of the third place. What we're saying is that it's the bringing together all the community facilities that are going to be a key part in terms of the design or the community that we have in there. We've got some evidence around the earthquakes, the bushfires, the events, the tragic events that turn up. We know that there is a need for it, and it needs for us to be able to fashion a way forward that we can do. What I'm really interested in is around that idea, and you'll all have your own stories within that, the subtlety of how that shifts. So as an elite athlete, we were constantly thinking of how can we make these subtle adjustments on how we work and play so that we can be better. And it's the same, I think, with design. How can we make these subtle changes within our communities that will ultimately result in a fantastic experience? So a couple of small things just to leave you on. So how can design evolve? Because that's the other question. How do we design something into the future from where we are now? It's very difficult to project forward. But I think we need to design for who we are. I don't think we need to design for buildings. Like the idea of object building for the sake of an object sitting out there in the middle of the park, I think is an old concept. We need to be able to design who we are. As designers, we certainly have an impact on shaping that environment, and in some ways we can design people through our buildings, but we need to be able to design who we are. Everyone gets to have their say. This idea of consultation is a positive thing, I think. Doing some work with some groups, and I know there's people in here. Dan, you're doing some great, there's some stakeholder management, you know, listening and gathering those ideas off people are really enriching and empowering for the people, but also fantastic for us to be able to get a little bit of insight, because ultimately they're the ones who will have to occupy those buildings long before we're gone. So we're in that time of change, and I think that whole idea around those components and the influences that we all individually have, I think can be tipped into this idea of the third place. And so ultimately for me, it's about, you know, let's design together around this third place. It's not just around, for me as an architect, to design something and expect people to occupy it. It's about gathering everyone in and going, we can actually do this together in collaboration, and we can create these third places that are going to be able to enrich all of us going forward. Thank you very much.